All right, I hope everyone had a lively discussions going on over lunch. Welcome back. We've got 2 on-stage discussions, 2 panels coming up. And some of you may have noticed what's going on outside. We have some small-scale, large drones and some people who came to, I'm not sure if they're supporting us or not. The verdict's out. But the purpose of DARC is really, at its core, to engage critically with this technology. We're largely focused on civilian applications, but it's impossible to do a conference like this without acknowledging what's happening in the wider world and what's actually, how this technology is being deployed right now as we speak. And so that's the purpose of this upcoming discussion. It's Life Under Drones. We have BBC journalist Tara McKelvey, who's going to be moderating. She's going to introduce you to all of the panelists. And so I would love to have a round of applause for the entire panel.
Hi, thanks very much for coming here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. Come on, you guys. And I have to tell you that you guys are a lot more interestingly dressed than people at most of the drone panels that I go to. So it's a nice break. The subject, of course, is Life Under Drones. I see it written here, and also my name, which is very helpful. And we will talk about that and also about media coverage. A United Nations official once told me that CNN shows the rockets taking off, and Al Jazeera shows them landing. So however you cover the story of drones, it's intensely political and complicated. Historians say that war has evolved over the years. It's gone from hand-to-hand combat to catapults to weapons that fire from an even further distance. And certainly from the Balkans, from the Vietnam to the Balkans, Americans have favored airstrikes over the deployment of ground troops. And that's also true in the fight against Al-Qaeda. Drones are the signature weapon of President Obama. He's authorized more than 6 times the number of strikes that his predecessor did. The question is, how are they being deployed? At the same time, surveillance programs are also being ramped up. The old-fashioned kind, which are done with security cameras, are now being replaced by iPhones. So your iPhone is very useful, and it can also be used against you. iPhones and drones are both tools, and they can be used for good and evil. And nowhere is this seen more starkly than in Pakistan. Drones on the ground, I've seen them when they're in the airplane hangars up in Syracuse, New York. They look very primitive and clunky. And the air, they're very graceful. And I'm told that they sound like hornets. They are precise, and they kill fewer innocent people than airstrikes did in the past. But still, they have a psychological impact. Sometimes they have an effect on the pilots, the ones who drop the bombs, and mostly they have an effect on the people who live on the ground. Most people in Pakistan hate drones, and a lot of them hate Americans too. They hate drones because they are killing people, and even worse, they are doing it from a distance. There's a difference between what drones do in Pakistan and what they do here and in Europe. Here and in Europe, drones are used not to drop bombs, but to monitor the weather, to make Smurf movies, things like that. But still, things in the sky freak people out. And these concerns about machines that fly on their own and robots that kill have an impact on policy making. Crazy or not, these ideas will influence the way drones operate here in the US. And now I'd like to introduce my co-panelists. We have here Chris Rogers, who's a human rights lawyer with Open Society Foundation, and Madiha Tahir, who is a journalist and a filmmaker, and her film is called Wounds of Waziristan, and Wazhmah Osman, who is a professor at Temple University and also a filmmaker. And Madiha, would you like to speak first?
Sure. I was preparing for this panel when I was sort of playing the live stream of this morning in the background. So I have some comments, and then I want to make some comments about some of the stuff that I heard this morning. But let me start with a quote, and this quote is from a newspaper article, and the quote is as following. Dara Adam Khail, a small burg in Pakistan's tribal areas, is the quintessential frontier town. Picture Wyatt Earp sashaying down the streets of Tombstone in a turban, and you get the idea, end quote. And the idea you get is this: a dusty, undomesticated, rugged, liminal zone populated by coarse natives and a hardened lawgiver, Wyatt Earp. And you get this idea because you, whom Nicholas Schmidl, the reporter, is addressing in this Washington Post article, the you that he imagines he is speaking to, are well versed in the colonial settler American legacy. For you, the phrase quintessential frontier town conjures up images of dirt streets and gunfights, a precarious romantic existence wrenched from an unforgiving territory. Now, if for you frontier town happens to denote colonial settler politics and brutal attacks on indigenous populations and racism, then you are beyond the orbit of this article. It is not addressed to you. Schmidl's opening lines, followed by depictions of the town's gunsmiths and smugglers, its illicit businesses, and freshly pressed slabs of hashish cured in goat skins, are effectively a nudge and a wink to those in the know. The sketch narrates not just a town, but also a linked series of insiders and outsiders. Readers who will walk alongside the journalist, thrilled at this place so, quote, like the Wild Wild West plus Al-Qaeda, that is the title of the piece. People who will do the gawking and people who will be gawked at. The journalist will stare and scribble and snap photos like an ugly tourist, to borrow Jamaica Kincaid's phrase. And back home, his home, a rapport will develop between this journalist, who is the son of Marine Lieutenant General Robert E. Rooster Schmidl, who's been involved with head of Cyber Command, and this reader, the one he says gets the idea. Certainly the Wild West narrative is grander and more interesting than the tepid facts. Dara Adam Khail is one of 6 administrative units known as frontier regions that mark an internal boundary between Pakistan and the so-called settled areas where the Pakistani constitution applies, and the tribal areas on the other side, which are still governed by 1901 British-era colonial regulations. Lying in northwest Pakistan along the border with Afghanistan, the federally administered tribal areas, or FATA, are a political and juridical category comprising of these frontier regions, as well as 7 administrative divisions known as agencies. Most of the American bombing by drone occurs in 2 of these agencies, South Waziristan and North Waziristan, the bulk of it in the latter. So when Schmidl turns an administrative unit, a frontier region, into the frontier of the American Wild West, he transforms the sundry, squishy details of an otherwise obscure geography into a stable, familiar account. Without having to be told, one knows that beyond the frontier town must lie the Badlands, the savage, wild territory populated by tribals who roam between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The frontier marks the limit. Interestingly, Schmidl writes, quote, "It's hard to believe that the limits of American power and the future of how it's projected could reside in the streets of a Wild West era holdover like this," end quote. It's hard to believe that the limits of American power. A curious phrase that gobbles up this area into the history and trajectory of the United States. Schmidl is not operating on a simile here. He is not saying that this area is a frontier for Pakistan, just as the Wild West was once a frontier for the United States. Instead, he quite literally transposes an American history and an American trajectory, an American narrative, the Wild West, onto Pakistan. And along with it come a whole host of ideas and concepts: civilization and barbarism, modern and savage, control, domestication, extermination. If Manifest Destiny once attempted to swallow indigenous Americans, it now chomps down on the darker parts of the globe. So our journalist hands out his stories and his photos. He hands out slices of Pakistan like squares of lemon cake at a tea party to be devoured and destroyed at will. He hands out a deck of cards. And in Pakistan, a baby less than a year old, her name was Javeria, crawling, babbling child who is just learning to say dad, is ripped up and exterminated along with her mother in March 2010 because some robot operator somewhere, hunched over a screen, thinks he has located a militant, a savage in the Wild West. In 2009, a Hellfire missile slams into a teenager, Sadallah, and his family, including his wheelchair-bound uncle. Sadallah had to have his legs amputated. He survived a few years, but ultimately died from complications last year. President Obama baptized, in fact, his first day in office by killing the relatives of another teenager, Fahim Qureshi, who also lost his eye. These are the things that I was thinking of when I was listening to the stream, and I was thinking about how to connect what is going on there in the far reaches of Pakistan to what is going on here in America, and I think there is a connection. And the connection is, you know, I think quite evident to some communities. It is stop and frisk, it is Sean Bell, it is Trayvon Martin. Technology cannot save us from our own racism. We live and think and feel in a world in which race is a central fact. When a video of a man being beaten, Rodney King, can be turned at a trial as an example of how Rodney King was in fact threatening police officers, which is what happened with that video. It became evidence for his guilt rather than for his innocence, and the guilt of the police officers. When that can happen, then we know that the problem is not one of pixelation and clearer vision, but one of racism. Yesterday, a study came out that 100% of the individuals bitten by LAPD police dogs in the first 6 months of 2013 were Black and Latino. This is not an accident. When Sadallah or Fahim Qureshi or Javeria are hit by Hellfire missiles, that is not an accident. It is not collateral damage. The system works that way because it is intended to work that way, and brown bodies are the first ones to be killed. So when the AUVSI person this morning, his first name I think was Michael, I forget, and I apologize, I don't remember his last name. He stood up here this morning and he told the audience here that, you know, most people don't get it. Most people associate a predator with a Hellfire missile with the word drone. That's what they associate. But you guys, he said, you get it. You're not normal. You understand. And he says it with the air of letting you in as if he's letting you into a secret. He said it with the air of he's letting you into the secret of your own specialness. And the idea that he's trying to get across to you is this techno-utopia which will save all sorts of species from harm. At one point, a picture of an elephant flashes up, and he talks about saving elephants. I think this was the same presentation this morning. And he talks about how the buzzing of the drone will help control the movement of these elephants so that they don't get into situations that will harm them. Of course, when he is talking about the buzzing, I am recalling my interviews with drone survivors who tell me how 7 to 8 drones hover overhead. They talk about the buzzing, which is especially loud at night, and children hide in their beds. Sadallah, the teenager who finally died from his complications, he wouldn't actually go, I interviewed him, he wouldn't actually go around to the side of the house where the attack had happened, and he suffered from nightmares. The survivor of the other attack that killed the little baby girl, the survivor, a teenage boy, hides in his room when the buzzing starts now. He shuts the door and tries to shut out the noise. So forgive me, but I think Michael was being quite disingenuous when he talks about saving species and he talks about the care of life, when actually so much of the serious money for this technology comes out of the military. The chairperson of the AUVSI, which is the organization the speaker this morning represented, is John Laidman of Northrop Grumman Court. So is the treasurer of AUVSI, incidentally, also a person from Northrop Grumman Court. Northrop makes the global hawk for the Navy, and these organizations are not about the care of animals or species, but rather about the destruction of humans being reduced to animals. The drone operators call them cockroaches. They refer to people being killed by drones as bug splat. So the technophilia of this conference worries me. I would say it even frightens me. It goes from the military to groups like the AUVSI, all the way to the left and the Occupy movement, and it generates conferences like these, in which the left and the right meet in a so-called marketplace of ideas, in which we are supposedly meeting on equal terms and dialoguing. But the fact is that Shahzad Akbar, who was supposed to be here, the lawyer who represents some of these people who are attacked by drones, is not able to enter the country because he is not able to get a visa because the United States government will not allow him to come here to speak to you. There is no lobby for Sadallah or Fahim Qureshi. There's hardly an anti-war movement these days. There is a lobby for drones, though, and there are groups like AUVSI. And there are lots of pretty drone photos around, and I've seen them some this morning, and I believe you'll probably be flying some of them in the evening. But at the same time, a photo that I sent in to be used at this conference was deemed too controversial, and it was a photo of me simply standing next to a son of somebody who had been killed in a drone attack. So I mean, I understand the conundrum. The organizers told me that there had already been some sort of backlash to some of the language at this conference, and that people perhaps didn't want to hear about targeted killings at a drone conference. So perhaps you do get the idea, but I wonder what idea it is that you get when we talk about drones. And I hope that this conversation will happen in a manner that takes seriously into account the material, institutional network in which drones will occur, and much of that has to do with the military and not the technophilic dreams of the left. Thank you.
I actually had a PowerPoint which I thought I would be able to show. It's slides from my research in Afghanistan. I did ethnographic field work there for a year. However, even though panels earlier had access to this massive screen, I was told I can't upload my slides, but I'll still give my speech, and it's about 10 minutes long. And we all look forward to leaving plenty of time for a discussion from you. Early in the year, I was invited to a policy conference in DC on Afghanistan that featured government organizations such as the Department of Defense and trans-governmental organizations such as the World Bank. One of the big topics of conversation was over fears of yet another civil war in Afghanistan, with the impending withdrawal of international military presence there in 2014. One presenter there was using what's called game theory, which is a simulation program, and it generated 14 different hypotheses of possible civil war outcomes based on inputting minimal factors such as geography and weaponry. I also noticed military specialists were extolling the benefits of robotics and long-distance surveillance and weaponry. To me, their computer models, void of all race, ethnicity, and gender markers, or using very crude racializations and abstractions of people, looked more like video game theory. The danger of simulated and distance warfare is that it deliberately blurs the distinction between the real and the virtual, thereby obfuscating accountability. For Baudrillard, the danger lies at the moment that the simulation moves from imitation or being a mimetic copy and becomes its own truth by surpassing a real and becoming the hyperreal. Or as Varolo states, the moment virtual reality overtakes the real. In this distantiation and abstraction of war, promises are made by military and technology industries, and the future of warfare is projected as bloodless, smarter, and cleaner due to the superiority of digital abilities. The goal with this panel, when we originally proposed it, Madiha and I, was to interrogate these technologies that have created another universe of simulation, simulacra, and the hyperreal from a multidisciplinary perspective. In my talk, I will use case studies from my research in Afghanistan to bring people back into the equation and into the picture, although surprisingly, I can't show any pictures, or not so surprisingly. Specifically, I will address the racialized and gender dimensions of war and its ramification on local populations generally, as well as the people who report on war, especially local fixers, translators, and journalists who are on the front lines. So my first card was going to be a series of different articles, and The title was Hypermasculinity, Hyperreality, and Protectionism, Saving the Homeland and/or Racialized and Gendered Others from Their Own Barbarity. And the first article I wanted to show was, it was called Tajikistan Tantrum Over Red River Invasion Video Game, which was a video game in which the US helped save people on the border in Tajikistan from Islamic extremists, and then they come over across the border into Afghanistan as well because of their fear of the fundamentalist movement moving across the border. And then the next article I wanted to interrogate was that it's called The CIA Chiefs Face Arrest Over Horrific Evidence of Bloody Video Game Sorties or Parties by Drone Pilots. And there you can see the distinction between what is a video game and virtual reality and the real just becomes it just becomes completely blurred. And then the final one was article that was on this slide is called Red Dawn Makes Me So Racist. An Asian American woman reacts to the remake of Red Dawn, which was a film that was then made into a video game. And then the film also had a remake about a North Korean invasion. And so this captures all the Twitter comments from the article where they talk about the racialized dimensions of saving people. So post 9/11, Afghan people were stereotyped in the mainstream Western media and popular culture. In order to justify the American military assault on the Taliban, all Afghan women became extreme victims of backwards, misogynist, villainous Afghan men. Afghan culture was interpolated as static, unchanging, and bound by archaic, problematic traditions. Based on earlier colonial iconographies, this trope simultaneously creates what's been called the trope of rape and rescue fantasy in regards to racialized women, and a death chant for savage and barbaric racialized men such as Osama and Saddam, who, not so surprisingly, both have been killed. This is a common strategy with a long history that has moved into new technologies recently. Video games are predicated on these racist tropes with its visual culture. Of course, in this abstraction and distantiation, the line between video games and real war is not surprisingly being erased. Hypermasculinity, hyperreality, and protectionism overlap to serve the overlapping interests of the culture and military technology industries. And these are just a few examples that I gave. So my next title card was going to be called Disparities and Hierarchies of Journalism on the Front Lines, which is where most of my research in Afghanistan was, with local media makers and journalists and fixers. And there's a very clear hierarchy where which I had on the slide that shows international correspondence, then it's embedded journalists, and then finally on the bottom rung is local fixers, translators, camera people, and journalists. So the US military has also systematically targeted journalists in war zones. US missile strikes on media personnel during the 2003 Iraq invasion killed a reporter from Al Jazeera and cameramen from Reuters, Spanish TV, and several local TV stations in Baghdad. This despite the fact that they had given their exact locations to media personnel before the invasion. In Afghanistan, during the US launching of Operation Anaconda and Operation Enduring Freedom post 9/11, the US military also bombed the Al Jazeera Kabul office along with at least 3 local news agencies. These larger structures of racism and sexism are also embedded in the inequities and disparities that exist in the international news production chain. During my fieldwork in Afghanistan, I witnessed the power dynamics and hierarchies that favor international correspondents and embedded journalists and place local fixers, translators, camera people, journalists in grave danger. Reporters on the front lines face an onslaught of danger from international military, insurgents, and mercenaries. They are targeted in their hotels, studios, and in the field. When danger strikes, such as kidnapping and attacks, the international correspondents are oftentimes negotiated for and rescued, while the local ones are left behind and deemed as disposable and dispensable. I will briefly describe 3 cases from my research. Well, the first picture I had in my next slide was of Ajmal Naqshbandi, and he was a fixer translator for an Italian journalist. When they were captured by the Taliban, the Italian journalist was negotiated for by releasing 5 Taliban prisoners, and Naqshbandi was left behind and later beheaded by the Taliban. You would also see the pictures. I had slides of people protesting in Kabul because journalists have a very special position, local journalists, of being heroes in Afghanistan. So there were massive protests that I had slides of from all the different people who I described who've been killed. The next one is of Rizaq Mamoon, who I came to know, the next 2 people, through my research there. And Rizaq Mamoon and Sultan Munadi were also targets of violence. Mamoon was the host of a news show last year. What you would see in the picture, he wasn't killed, thankfully, but he was the victim of an acid attack by Iranian government agents for having a TV show that criticized their involvement in Afghanistan's internal affairs. And then the last person who is Sultan Munadi. While I was there, another journalist friend, Sultan Munadi, was killed by ISAF, which is the International Security Armed Forces. He was working as a fixer translator for the New York Times. For a New York Times reporter, when they were captured by the Taliban, the British military rescued the New York Times reporter, and in the process, shot and killed Munadi. Needless to say, there was massive protest for him too, as he was a very prominent and well-respected journalist. Local journalists play a vital role in the international news production chain. They have the cultural access and understanding, including language skills and local ties, that enable them to report in many regions that foreign correspondents could not traverse alone. Their cultural access also frees them from embedded journalism and reliance on prepackaged news. Often without ties to agenda-setting institutions, they uncover international, local connections and cover-ups. They are also more likely to get to the front lines to show the realities and atrocities of war at its most gruesome. The next set of images I had were from my, which is also my last set of images, was from a trip that I went on a US military Chinook helicopter along with a group of journalists who were invited on Ambassador Eikenberry's diplomatic mission after an incident that resulted in civilian casualties. What you would see would be me and a bunch of other soldiers on this trip. So on this trip, I observed some of the constraints Afghan media makers face, but also the larger problem of embedded journalism. This was you would see a picture of the DOD, or Department of Defense, media officer who was directing our movement. The focus was to be only on Eikenberry's conciliatory gestures. There were no opportunities to speak to or meet with survivors. And then you would also see 2 television reporters who in the picture you'd see they look very uneasy because they're local reporters amongst all these soldiers, and they were embedded with the US soldiers. They also did not give them they gave me a vest, but they were not given vests. Yet despite the restrictions, Afghan journalists managed to show a variety of news, real violence, and a lot of it. So in conclusion, in the US, due to the stratified nature of capitalism, news-based televisual violence is censored by the overlapping interest of the advertising industry, television executives, and the government. As seasoned anti-war activists know, showing the realities of war and war-related violence is a very effective means of perhaps not achieving peace, but at least coalescing public opinion in the tide of change against war. If we are truly to understand, as this panel is called, Life Under Drones, then having brave journalists documenting the impact of military drones, including war crimes, is absolutely essential. They play a key role in bringing the realities of war home, thereby counteracting the abstracted, simulated, distant, and sanitized versions that hegemonic institutions represent. In conclusion, these are just a few of the many media-related crimes and murders, Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, NYU, which is an Afghan-based journalist watchdog group that's actually supported by USAID, but they do some incredible research. They've been documenting rising statistics and acts of violence and murders perpetuated against media makers, yet no arrests are made and no one is prosecuted in most of these cases. Currently, self-censorship is becoming more and more prevalent amongst media makers. Over the last decade, it has taken a Foucauldian turn to self-discipline as a means of appeasing elites. Once the venues for mass communication and mediation are controlled and censored by direct force and/or fear and intimidation, cultural debates cease to be in the service of the public. This, of course, is the primary role of media in functioning democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Chris, I'd like to hear from you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. As was mentioned, Shahzad Akbar, who's a friend, was supposed to be here, so I've been asked to step in, so I apologize if my remarks are a little bit more ad hoc, but hopefully of interest and will be basis for a good discussion. And by way of introduction, on that note, and just to sort of be clear about where I come from to this issue, I'm a human rights lawyer by background. I work with an organization called the Open Society Foundations, which is a large foundation engaged in democratization, human rights, and civil society building throughout the world. But I focus particularly on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and have been based there and spend much of my time there now looking at conflict-related issues from detentions to civilian casualties and civilian protection, among those being US drone strikes. So in that role, I've engaged in quite a lot of research on the ground, both myself as well as with organizations, Pakistani organizations on the ground, examining the effects of drone strikes on civilians. And I guess I'll sort of take that as my starting point in this notion of what it is to live under drones and in these areas. And to pick up on a point made by Madiha, the idea that drones have a lobby in this country, but victims and individuals in affected countries don't have a lobby of their own. I think that's important to keep in mind. And this other point about what narratives, what voices get privileged, what voices get credibility, what stories get told. And there's a range of reasons for that. And firstly, I think it's not easy to access these areas, particularly in Pakistan, for a range of reasons. They are blocked by the military. Many of these areas, militant groups are active and present threats not only to outsiders or outside researchers or Westerners, but also to Pakistanis, particularly those not from these areas. I can go through a litany of the kinds of threats and very serious security complexities of trying to engage in fact-finding in these areas. But overlaying that is the fact that this is a very contested space and a very politicized space, and one in which power is important. Individuals who are in these areas who have very little access to telecommunications or media, illiteracy is high, education is low, unemployment is high, in many, many different ways. They are disempowered, and their stories and I think their perspectives of what it is to live in these areas go untold very often and not internalized by us, the public, as well as the US government and other powers that have influence in these spaces. On that note, I think I would also, and I think much has been talked about in terms of, or much has been referenced to the psychological impact of living in these areas, the idea of drones, not just surveillance, but I think the uncertainty of living in an area in which a strike could happen at any given time. And these are not, this is not a large area, right? And so the density of military operations, and particularly drones, is very, very high, and the effect is very, very acute on those living in these circumstances. But I do think that one thing that is sometimes lost on conversations here in the United States, I find, is the larger context within which drone strikes occur in a place like Pakistan. And I can speak to Pakistan in particular, and I would put aside other places like Yemen and Somalia, where I don't have as direct experience. But in Pakistan, drones occur within a larger security and political context, One in which Pakistani military operations are going on in these areas. There are F-16 strikes, shelling, mortar attacks, curfews, displacement instigated by Pakistani military, as well as militant groups that have different levels and degrees and territories of control, and in different areas with the acquiescence of the Pakistani military to the degree that they essentially rule these areas. And impose rules and engage in organized crime and intimidation and assassinations and so forth. So this is the context, the larger context within drone strikes are going on. And I think oftentimes that frame is lost. So to think about what it's like to live under drones, I think we also have to, at least in Pakistan, we also have to say, what is it like to live in Fatah? What is it like to live in a place in which you don't have any rights vis-a-vis your own government, where your own government, your own military has abandoned you, has legally and politically abandoned you? And what is that like? And that's the context within which the United States is then conducting strikes, is conducting drone strikes and assassinations. And so I think it's very important whenever we try to understand what is it like to live under drones is to A, contextualize that situation and understand what it means from people's perspectives, and B, also understand and be critical, as the others have mentioned, of media accounts, and to recognize that those that are living under these circumstances don't have the resources, power to be able to have their stories told. And so that's where I come from it, and I think that our organization tries to access these areas and to lift up those voices. On the issue of technology very quickly, I think also there, and I'm a little less privy to some of the other panels that have gone on here, although I certainly understand that the technological aspect of drones is a major focus here. And I do think, at least I would say from the human rights community perspective, or sort of the political dialogue on drones, that there is a sort of technological determinism that goes on either side, which I find very problematic. In my view, at least, one of the challenges is how to conceptualize drones, whether it's civilian or military use, or I would look at it particularly from the military use side. At least this is where I come from. And the question is, how do we understand this phenomena, right? How do we problematize it? And then what kind of judgments do we make, and what kind of policies or laws should we advocate for, right? But that first order question of how do we conceptualize the problem is very, very important. I think it's too often informed by sort of, again, technological determinism, that drones are either good or bad. I've talked to many individuals in the military, and they say this publicly, that drones, and people in the human rights community, that drones are no different than any other weapon, that they are just a platform. What's the difference between using a cruise missile and a drone, or a targeted airstrike by an F-16? And there's an equivocation there, which I think is very effective in public discourse, and it has a certain logic to it, especially from a legal point of view. On the other hand, I think that there's a certain polemicization around drones as a scary technology, as associated with robots, and we were all familiar with this discourse as well, which I think is problematic. And I think that I'm not saying there's a middle ground, I just think that we have to approach drones like we do any other problem, or any other technology, in a responsible way, which is look at the real world effects of a technology and how it matches on to facts and people's lives, right? And once we do that, then we can start to understand, how do we conceptualize this phenomena? How do we problematize it? And in doing that, right, one of the problems that we have systematically is that people who live in these circumstances, like Pakistanis who live abandoned by their government, left to militants, under threat from all sides, right, their voices and the costs that drones affect on their communities are not being internalized in that conversation. And so I think that in terms of understanding how we should conceptualize the technology of drones and its impact, one of the things we should be doing first and foremost is understanding those voices better, their perspectives, and finding ways to give them greater platforms for speaking about these realities. And so with that, I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Thank you for your fascinating presentations, and I'd like to open it up for questions. Who has questions? Nobody has any questions?
Oh, no, they have questions here.
Oh, it's hard to see. Sorry, I'm blind. Would you like to
bring up the light a little?
Do you have a mic?
I think there's mics.
It's hard for people to hear you. You can take mine.
This question's from Madiha. Not to let the US off the hook at all. But do you hold the governments in Pakistan or Afghanistan accountable for allowing these strikes to happen? I mean, a drone entered Iranian airspace and it was promptly shut down and then copied, which scares me a little bit, but as an Iranian. But I mean, do you hold these governments also accountable? Because they are not even, at the very least tacitly, but I think actively involved in providing intelligence, good or bad, to the US on where to strike and when to strike.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact is drones cannot happen. I mean, as a weapon, they need consent by the host state, right? Otherwise, they're fairly easy to shoot down. And so these would not be happening without the consent of the Pakistani military. But I think it's interesting to me that that is always the first question. And Chris knows this. There was recently a panel about Bagram at the Open Society Institute, and one of the first questions, repeated questions in fact, that came up was about what's the problem with Pakistan, right? It's like, I think people very quickly want to dismiss, I mean, the US is the superpower here. The US funds the Pakistani military. The Pakistani military is not under the control of the Pakistani civilian government. And for decades, this process has been going on where we don't effectively have a substantive democracy. And so the result of that is that, yes, absolutely, the Pakistani state now colludes with the American government to produce a situation in which drone attacks happen, in which that area, Fatah. So I go, as Chris mentioned, North Waziristan is blocked off. So I go to the border area, town, which is Bannu, and people from North Waziristan come there for all sorts of things, for all sorts of school, various businesses, etc. And so I have talked to people there, and a lot of people there. So drones are one issue. The insurgent violence there is another issue. The army attacks there are a third issue. I mean, and it's not just the attacks, it's daily petty humiliations at checkpoints. And these people in this area are absolutely not treated like Pakistani citizens. Even Pakistani citizens are humiliated quite often by the army within Pakistan proper, but particularly in the tribal areas, they're absolutely not, they're heavily marginalized. So yeah, the Pakistani state does collude with the US.
Yeah. Thanks. Maybe we should go to another question. So someone else would like to? Yes, over here? Mm-hmm. And if you could say your name and something about your relationship to drones, that would be helpful.
My name is Ron Evans. I'm a technologist and developer of open source robotics software. My question is something that Chris had touched on. I'd like to maybe get a little something from the other panelists. Why do you think drones are hated and considered more scary than other forms of weaponry which are used in warfare? Is it the boogeyman effect, that they're being used to seem scarier than they are? Is there actually something different than warfare now than there was? Maybe you could weigh in on that, please, and thank you.
That's a great question. Do you guys want to take that on?
I mean, I could just say the quick answer is that drones are oftentimes represented in the media as, and this is what I talked about in my talk as well, as that it's cleaner, it's smarter, it's precise, it's bloodless, like smart bombs. And so that's where I think the danger is where traditional warfare, people know it's bloody, and oftentimes, especially if you're able to have frontline coverage, you can see that, and that's a very important component of living in a functioning democracy, is to be able to have accurate representations, be it of technology or what our foreign policy does in other places. So that would be the main reason for me why.
Anybody else want to say something? We'll go to another question.
I mean, I think, part of it is that drones, I mean, it is a unique capability. Drones are different in some regard. I think it's indisputable that, if not for the technological capability of drones basically to be unmanned, so not having the kind of force protection issues that you would have in other weapon systems or operations, you would not have thousands of people and hundreds of drone strikes over the last 6 to 10 years in Pakistan. It simply wouldn't have happened. Now, does that make it right or wrong, good or bad? I think what happens is that we're seeing a nature of operations that we're not sure around drones that particular technological capability enables, and we're not sure what to make of it, right? And it's going on outside of traditional battlefields and exploiting a blurred line of law enforcement and war, right? And it's at that juncture that drones are pushing a boundary in a very worrisome way. And in that way, I do think that technology matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds right. Can I get to the question? Yeah, over there. And again, if you could say your name and something about what you're doing here.
Hi, I'm in Davisor. I'm an artist and educator working with technology, various ways. And thanks for these interesting kind of mini talks. And you were talking a lot about these people who lack a voice and also the lack of media right now. So I would just love for there to be a way to access all this media that you wanted to show us, if you could share it in some way, via Twitter or whatever. And just direct us to resources where we can access those stories that you're talking about. So.
It's a good suggestion. Other questions? Someone shouted. Okay, please, in the back with hand up. And if you could say your name, that'd be very helpful.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman. I've covered conflicts in the Third World since the 70s in Africa and the Middle East, and also written about Afghanistan. Air warfare has been used in imperial control since before the First World War against the Senussi tribes in Libya. The RAF used it in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., and Somalia. And I think that there's a wider question here of a policy issue, because the use of drone warfare, I have friends who work in Joint Special Operations Command, they describe it as the Death Star being imposed on a country or an area of operations. That is, we're not just talking about drone strikes, we're talking about manned aircraft strikes, we're talking about special operations strikes. So I think it has to be wider contextualized than just simply focusing on drone warfare. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a comment because I've covered these things and been on the ground there. So the question to you guys is that what makes you think the public in the United States will pay attention to this issue, since they perceive the people in the areas in Pakistan as being partly responsible, or where the people that we fight against come from? Why should they care about that?
The question is why should American audiences care about the issue? Correct? You guys, go ahead.
I mean, the quick answer is I think, and I don't know if it's the social circles I run in, but I give talks often, and I also made an anti-war film such as Madiha. Whenever I meet people in various venues, I think that the American public do care. They want to be informed. They want to have better news. And I think they are aggravated with the state of affairs, both in terms of the corporatization of media as well as the foreign policy and them not having a voice. So that would be my take on it, is that I think most people are genuinely concerned because they know that globalization affects them as well, and it all comes back around and it's all interconnected.
I would say that basically, I think we have to disaggregate the idea of an American public. There's no such thing as the American people. There are a lot of different kinds of publics in the United States, and I think some of those publics, particularly marginalized communities, understand instinctively, I think, the logic that is behind this kind of warfare, which is used in non-white spaces much better than others, right? So the logic that when Trayvon Martin is killed and we have a national conversation about the fact that this kid was wearing a black hoodie and this made him suspicious and therefore in some way responsible for his own death, that is the same logic as when President Obama decides that a military-age male who's killed in a strike zone should be counted as a militant because why was he there? So basically they are people who are not white in this, the racial logic is that people who are not white are responsible for the preservation of their own life. And if they get killed in the process, then because they appeared suspicious, then it was their fault for appearing suspicious. And I think certain publics understand that.
Chris, you have something to say?
Very quick, 2 cents. I think, in short, war is often wrong and always bad, right? So, why should the American public care about this? Because, it's could be wrong and it's bad. And the point is that, because we don't want war, right? We've set up rules and regulations to decide when it is that we are in war, and a democracy to decide and to deliberate when we extend and use that power. The problem is that in areas like Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and again, going back to the technology itself, it disrupts that, right? And it robs Americans for the ability to know and understand when their country is engaging in war and perhaps engaging in activities that they would find morally reprehensible. So in order to even have that discussion, we have to know what the United States is doing where, on what legal basis, and that to be told to the American people. So it is about Pakistanis, which we should care about, and people who are being affected by this. But it also matters, and it goes to the heart of what it means to be a citizen of this country.
Thank you. More questions? Over here, please. Somebody co-opted. Okay. If you could say your name, please, that'd be great.
Thank you. My name is Beau, and I'm here as a technologist. I'm really grateful that you guys came out and presented today. I think it's very interesting. Maybe you can comment on the similarity I see between the broad brushstrokes you were painting about racism, which is obviously a huge issue and very pertinent, as you pointed out, and also the same brush that gets painted across this technology of drones. I think it's interesting. Did you know that the Northrop Grumman Global Hawk that you mentioned in the same sentence as bug splats is actually unarmed and is used in surveillance for like a Fukushima disaster to evacuate people? And
do you,
so the question is, do you think that the same racism that gets applied to peoples that we don't know enough about gets applied to drones because people don't know enough about them?
Racism against drones. All right, here we go. Forging intellectual ground. Is there racism against drones, you guys? I don't know. Where's the drone?
The fact is that the term drone is used to describe a whole range of aerial robotics, right? My point is that at this conference, which is called the Drones and Aerial Robotics Conference, we have everything from a discussion about military drones right all the way down to hobby aerial small things that you guys will be flying around later. And I think what happens in that process when you have this discussion and you kind of lump it all, it's not me, it's actually, I'm saying it's problematic that all of these kinds of technologies are being, spoken of in one breath, because what that I think does is actually normalize the ideas that are behind the military uses of this technology, which has to do with surveillance, which has to do with displacing risk and only exposing certain types of people to harm. And I think that's what the problem is. And
thank you. That's an amazing answer to the hardest question ever. And we have time for one more question, you said, right? So please, if you could say your name.
Sure. David Solomanoff, president of the New York chapter of the Internet Society, although this is, I'm speaking personally here. I'm not sure how to phrase this as a question, but we've seen that there are peaceful uses for this technology in their military applications. But what I'm hearing here are some very legitimate questions about our foreign policy, civil liberties, and privacy, and I'm pretty much on the same page about being concerned about those things. But it seems like we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. If there are peaceful applications, certainly it seems to me that we should be able to go forward with that. If our foreign policy is wrong, then whether we use one technology or another, if it's morally wrong and tactically wrong, we shouldn't be doing it.
Is that a question?
Yes. I'm not sure how to phrase it as a question, but it's a challenge to the panel.
So the challenge, please, any responses to the challenge?
On some level, it seems to me like a sort of reformulation of our drones different question. And again, I think the answer is yes. Maybe not as much as people often extol about, but I do think drones are different. I give you another example. Cluster munitions. Again, I come from a weapons background, munitions background, human rights background. So cluster munitions have been banned, as have been landmines, right? Now you can use cluster munitions as a technology, right? And you can use it in a completely discriminatory way, right? They were designed to be dropped over large tank formations crossing, the lines in Eastern Europe, right? So, instead they're used in populated areas and in Baghdad, right? So that's a problem. And what we realized was that this weapon system, this technology matched up against the real world and how militaries and conflicts and policy interacts was such a risk and such a problem that we created a regime to either ban or regulate its use. right? And so in the same in drones, right? I mean, that's what we have to do. We have to look at that technology, see how its use matches up against the real world with real people, with real interests and real politics, and then decide what is a responsible way to understand those problems and regulate, you know, or have other forms of, you know, control over its use, to do that responsibly.
And I just wanted to quickly add to that also is that this is not a talk against all drones and civilian drones, but it's interesting that in this entire conference on drones, we are the only panel that is about the impact of drones on the ground, right? And so, and the military drones, and the fact is that the military industry, the military drones are the ones that have the bulk of the funding and fund most of this. And now there's all this other types of hobby culture and other things. And so that's why in this panel, we're talking about specifically those aspects of it.
So, you know, we're going to go ahead and get started with the next panel momentarily, but while the folks for the next panel come down, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Oh. So if you are on the next panel, please make your way down to the stage, and we'll just take 1 or 2 more questions.
How about this person here who's just raised his hand?
Hi, my name is Jack, and I'm here. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Jack, and I'm here because I came down to leaflet.
Leaflet perspective, please.
Yeah, so I really want to address what the panelists said. Excellent talks, thank you. How do we get away from this idea that drones are cool? Because I think that's really
that's a good question.
the
How do we
point.
get away from the idea drones are cool? That's an excellent question. You guys?
I mean, this is what I'm saying, is that
they're pretty cool.
This is the technophilia at this conference, that even though most of the funding is happening from the military, institutionally, economically, materially, this technology is embedded in certain power structures and is being used to great harm. There's a conflation between that and the hobby culture, and then that is actually used to normalize ideas around drones.
So
not just the technology itself, but also ideas about harm and risk and surveillance, right? Even if, like, it's fine, like there's peaceable purposes, uses for drones, and like Occupy can fly a drone and show, you know, the NYPD beating up Occupy kids. That's useful, but in the process, there's a certain idea about surveillance. And we really have to think through what the concepts and ideas that we are normalizing in the process of this technology.
Yeah,
I think I was going to say to Tara's question, how do we get away from the fetishization of drones, is that you have more panels like this. You have, you know, be able to see my slides. Madiha's made this film, Wounds of Waziristan, that had, you know, people who have on-the-ground experience, and then you'll see that it's not just, oh, cool, look at this drone that this hobby group made, or look at all these various other things. It brings the realities home when you see the impact of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think I use the word fetishization, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
And
so
I think that there is a reality.
Paging Frank Pascal, paging Frank Pascal.
Oh my God, it's so scary.
Please continue.
Where is this person?
He's a phantom.
I want to know what he had. So the question of drones really is, you can hear from what they've said, it's a very serious one that affects people in a really brutal way that's often not talked about in these forums. Chris, did you want to say something?
I think we have time for one last question. Maybe you can respond to this.
One more. If I can just, I was just going to just respond real quick to the, you know, sorry, how do we get away from drones are cool? I mean, I'm not sure that that's possible on some level, but, and I don't know what would be required to actually do that, right? But I guess what I'm concerned with is creating red lines and boundaries and realizing that when drones are being used in contexts like they are in Pakistan, we're talking about something qualitatively totally different, right? And it's completely objectionable that these kinds of operations are going on, and that our government and the administration has provided no information with respect to who is being killed, how many individuals, on what basis, what's the legal basis, does it have an understanding with the Pakistani government, has it consented to these strikes? None of this information is being shared. We know more about the safety, I don't know, record of mattresses than we know about targeted killing program in this country. And so, you know, that's what we should be focusing on, and distinguishing that set of questions and concerns from are drones cool?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my name's Adam Sloan. I'm the founder of a company called Bird's Eye View Aerobotics, and at this point I feel like I might be in the wrong place. Our goal is to bring this technology to the common man, to democratize it. So to follow up on the last question, how do we get away from this idea that drones are evil?
Great question. Drones, speak out. You guys have an answer.
I mean, I feel like this is like ask and answered on some level. But how do we get away from the idea that, I mean, sorry, excuse me. Maybe someone wants to take this for a second.
I think partly it's the responsibility of the hobbyists who want to do it and, you know, talk about it and like make clear that you are not for the use of this technology militarily. I think that's part of your responsibility. If you want to come under the umbrella of drone technology, I think, you know, conferences like these, like military drones should not be an acceptable form. And I think that is part of the responsibility of this community to make that clear and separate out what it is you intend to do with them than what the United States government or other governments want to do with them, which is kill people and surveil them.
Did you want to say something?
No, that was perfectly put, is that the hobbyist culture is being usurped or appropriated in these types of contexts to make it seem that military uses of drones are okay, and it's not. And so, as Madiha perfectly stated, it is your job to say, make a distinction between the two. We're not saying that civilian uses are wrong or evil or bad, but we're also pointing out the fact that the military ones are, and it's not a, you know, it's not a good use of our taxpayer money, and these are going to have implications down the line.
Yeah, and I would just say, yeah, I mean, I guess I would, you know, put it back on, you know, a community of technologists and developers and so forth, for those individuals to think about how they can constructively ensure that the positive elements of what they're trying to do and accomplish and develop are distinguished, right? And, you know, all forms of technology can be used for nefarious and unlawful and immoral purposes. But the point is to how to distinguish those things, right? And to make sure, I mean, why aren't, you know, individuals who are interested in the drone technology, why aren't they on the front lines pushing Congress to say to the United States President and the administration to make a clear drone policy, right? To have transparency and so forth. Why aren't those people allying with human rights groups to say exactly that, to make those distinctions clear? Because that would be in their interest as well. So I mean, I think that would be a very positive way forward.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, I think on that note we can finish our panel. You guys have been a great audience. Thanks a lot.